All right, it is noon. So hello everyone, welcome to the Freethought Society's August meetup. I hope those of you who logged on early enjoyed the music we provided during the pre-event social. My name is Michael Stephen Martin, and it is my pleasure to be the Zoom coordinator for the Freethought Society and your co-host for today's event. We do want to stay on target with our time, so I'm officially going to start the session by spotlighting my co-host and the president of the Freethought Society, Miss Margaret Downey.
Thank you, Michael. Welcome everyone to the Freethought Society's August 1st Zoom meeting. The Freethought Society serves as a local forum in which freethinkers can meet virtually, socialize, and exchange ideas thanks to the Zoom meetings set up by Michael Stephen Martin. As freethinkers, our minds are not restrained by superstitions or prescribed dogmas that tell us what we can and cannot think. While some today would suppress independent thinking, freethinkers know that unrestricted exchange of ideas have been the primary forces of progress in all civilizations. As freethinkers, we want to better ourselves and our community through the unrestrained application of reason and human endeavor to address the local and global problems that confront us. Now, on the screen, you will see a list of Freethought Society volunteer opportunities, and we hope one of our committees will be of interest to you. We would welcome your participation. The Freethought Society is a nonprofit 501c3 educational organization, and this is why we hope that you will be moved to make a donation today. A donation link will appear in the chat section a few times during this event, but if you miss it, the link is really easy. It's ftsociety.org/donate. Now, to introduce today's speaker is Freethought Society board member, Patrick Ennis.
Thank you, Margaret. Michael, thanks for giving me the opportunity to do this introduction. And I'd also like to thank the organizers for lining up today's speaker. I'm really looking forward to today's talk. Part of the system of oppression of Black people has been the deliberate devaluation of Black culture, and particularly Black history. In that regard, Black history and Freethought history share a similar distinction of being often ignored. Sorry, okay, there we go. Often ignored and even suppressed. Some years ago, a deeply Christian friend of mine presented me with a book by C.S. Lewis, who depicted himself as a former atheist. I accepted the gift gladly, since I'm always interested in hearing the thoughts of people who have bridged the gap between belief and unbelief, especially those unicorns who reject reason in favor of faith. One of the things that struck me in this book was Lewis's claim that in historical terms, atheism was a fairly recent invention. This was, to me, historical ignorance on the same level as those people who think that there weren't any Black people in the Old West, or perhaps more relevantly, no atheists in foxholes. But it did serve to, for one thing, convince me that Lewis's claim to have ever been an atheist was highly dubious, and also to illustrate the willful ignorance of Freethought history commonly displayed by people who are respected writers, philosophers, and educators. Can we really blame the average person for being similarly ignorant? Beyond that, imagine the layers of bias which overlay Black history and within Black Freethought history. But fortunately, now we have a fresh generation of scholars who are shedding light on this neglected area of history and giving us valuable insights into how we got where we are today. Dr. Christian Cameron is Associate Professor of History at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. Dr. Cameron holds a PhD in American history. He founded the African American Intellectual History Society, the AAIHS. And if you like American history, I would invite you to peruse their website at aaihs.org. There's a lot of interesting stuff there. Among Dr. Cameron's works are titles such as The Abolitionist Movement, Documents Decoded, To Plead Our Own Cause, African Americans in Massachusetts and the Making of the Anti-Slavery Movement, and most recently, Black Freethought, Black Freethinkers, A History of African American Secularism. This latest book examines a number of Black freethinkers from different periods of American history and provides context for understanding the complexity of the African American experience in a way that is much richer and more gratifying than the stereotype of uniform and universal mindless religious devotion. In today's talk, Black Free Thought from Slavery to Civil Rights, Dr. Cameron will address many of these interesting facets of our history. Welcome, Dr. Cameron.
Thank you, Patrick, for that introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very happy to be here with you all, or logged in with you all, and to share some of the research for my book, Black Freethinkers. Thank you to Margaret and Michael for organizing this talk, and to all of you for logging in. So I'll start with a brief discussion of how I got sort of interested in this project and sort of how it kind of developed from its earliest stages. And then I'll give sort of brief overviews or snapshots of each of the 4 chapters, and then sort of tie that together and what I think the ultimate significance of this work is, both kind of scholarly and just for Black freethinkers today. So I got interested in this project or started on it really in late 2012, probably around November, December 2012, when I was working on edits for my first book, To Plead Our Own Cause, and I was rereading through some of the sources. I think I was looking for a footnote for a reference. And I was rereading Al Raboteau's classic work, Slave Religion, on African-American religion in the antebellum South. And for most of the book, he's looking at the sort of syncretic fusion between Protestantism, evangelical Protestantism, and African religious traditions, and how that sort of process developed into what we know as slave religion in the 1840s and 50s. But there's a couple of paragraphs towards the end of the book where, he starts out, of course, not all slaves believed in these ideas I spent the last 300 pages talking about. Some simply couldn't reconcile notions of a just and benevolent God with their lives in slavery. And he gives, maybe 1 or 2 examples of religious skepticism in 18th and 19th century slave communities. Doesn't really dwell on it too much, but it really piqued my interest because that was the first reference that I had seen to religious skepticism and atheism within the slave community. So that kind of got me researching some of the few works that exist on Black humanism and Black free thought, works from the scholar Michael Lackey, who wrote a book on Black atheist writers in the 20th century. Of course, Akivu Hutchinson's works, Moral Combat and Godless Americana, and Anthony Pinn's important work on Black humanism. His collection, his documentary collection, By These Hands, was really important because it had sort of snippets of religious skepticism in various primary sources. And so there were sort of excerpts of those sources. And when I went back to the originals, like Frederick Douglass's narrative, I think he had an excerpt from one of his autobiographies. But when I went back and then read the full source, I saw there's actually quite a bit more than Pinn was really able to fit, because he was trying to give sort of a broad overview. So that sort of led me into just reading all the slave narratives I could, right? Narratives and sources that are usually used to document the Black religious experience, right? These are a lot of the sources that Raboteau uses for his book, Slave Religion. But when I read them with sort of different questions in mind, I found that they actually provided a lot of evidence of religious skepticism in 19th century slave communities. And then from there, I sort of expanded that into the 20th century and looking at novels and poetry of Black writers and intellectuals, and started to see that this is really, this atheism, agnosticism wasn't just present among, a few individuals here and there, but really, was much more widespread than people have thought. Right. And by the 20th century would become sort of a coherent and growing intellectual and anti-religious tradition in African American culture. So that's sort of how I got started on the project. It was also a moment for me where personally I was trying to sort of connect with other Black freethinkers, of whom I know very few, right? So I took to Twitter and Facebook and connected with Black non-believers on Facebook and other venues. And that also helped me to find some other sources as well, and help sort of introduce me to some new people. African Americans for Humanism, for example, which is now, which is no longer in existence, but was at the time, had a great resource of little bios of individual Black freethinkers. So in sort of kind of trying to connect personally and build community, virtual communities with other Black freethinkers, that's another thing that really sort of led me into this project and helped it develop in some of its earliest stages. So now to get into the book itself. What I'm going to do is sort of briefly outline the origins of African American free thought among 18th and 19th century slaves, sort of their main ideas, and then I'll get into the kind of growth and the greater coherence to the movement of Black freethinkers that starts to build in the early 20th century with the Harlem Renaissance. And with the rise of radical politics, with more African Americans being attracted to socialism and communism. And I'll end with a discussion of the many ways that secularism and freethinkers sort of played a role in the civil rights movement of the 1960s and 1970s. So African American free thought arose in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Unlike the Enlightenment origins of free thought among white intellectuals such as Thomas Jefferson and Thomas Paine, Black free thought initially grew out of the institution of slavery and the conditions that Blacks endured within it. So the increased evangelism to slaves that characterized the Second Great Awakening of the early 19th century, a massive series of religious revivals all across the country. This increased evangelism also brought to the fore what many slaves saw to be the hypocritical nature of their Christian masters, including the very practice of holding slaves itself, but also the way that their masters treated them. And one of the key reasons that African Americans in the 19th century embraced free thought and religious skepticism was an inability to resolve the problem of evil, the question of how to reconcile the existence of evil in the world with the presence of a benevolent and omnipotent deity, like Rabbitoh had mentioned in his book. And for many slaves, of course, the problem of evil was intimately related to their daily lives, as a key component of slavery was suffering, whether physical suffering and the abuse that would be inflicted upon slaves, or emotional suffering in seeing your children or your spouse sold away from you. Now, many enslaved people did find meaning in religion, whether monotheistic ones such as Christianity or Islam, or African-derived traditions such as conjure. But others rejected religion altogether because they did not believe that a life under slavery was valuable. And they needed an answer to the problem of suffering before they could accept the idea of a god or gods. When this answer didn't come, they embraced atheism as the only logical solution to the problem of evil. Now, for decades, historians like Rabbitoh and others, John Blassingame, have used slave narratives to document multiple aspects of the Black religious experience. But these narratives also speak to the presence of atheism and free thought within 19th century slave communities. So Austin Stewart, for example, an enslaved man in Prince William County, Virginia in the early 19th century, immediately after he's discussing his sister's brutal whipping on a Sabbath morning, which he's careful to point out that fact a number of times, that it was a Sunday morning. He asks in his narrative, his slave narrative, "Can anyone wonder that I, and other slaves often doubted the sincerity of every white man's religion. Can it be a matter of astonishment that slaves often feel there is no just God for the poor African? So Stewart is remarking here on the fact that when enslaved people witness this sort of physical torture being inflicted on themselves and others, right, when they undergo these experiences, a lot of them start to question their religion, and a lot of them move towards atheism, right? He says this occurred often. Exactly how often is unclear. However, when reading slave narratives, it does seem that atheism was likely more prevalent than we have thought, because the conditions that fostered it were normal, everyday occurrences among the enslaved. Charles Ball, another enslaved man, likewise reflected on the irreligiosity present in slave communities in his autobiography. He wrote, "There is in general very little sense of religious obligation or duty amongst the slaves on the cotton plantations, and Christianity cannot be with propriety called the religion of these people. They have not the slightest religious regard for the Sabbath day, and their masters make no efforts to impress them with the least respect for this sacred institution." So in this passage, Ball addresses one of the key components of free thought among slaves, namely a sort of disregard for the Sabbath that was fostered in part by masters' opposition to converting their slaves. And this is an opposition that stretched back really to the early 16th century and drew from this sort of European religious idea that anybody who's baptized can't be a slave, right? And despite the fact that a number of first British colonies and then states, had laws saying that, baptism or religious conversion has no effect on the status of a slave, this was really sort of ingrained within European and within English culture, right? So many slaves were just opposed to religious instruction and religious attendance for their slaves. Now, Henry Bibb, another enslaved man, wrote that the Sabbath is not regarded by a large number of slaves as a day of rest. So here he's echoing Charles Ball. Bibb says they have no schools to go to, no moral or religious instruction at all in many localities. Hence, they resort to some kind of amusement. Those who make no profession of religion, he says, resort to the woods in large numbers on that day to gamble, fight, get drunk, and break the Sabbath. So here we see, more sort of direct evidence from an enslaved person commenting on irreligiosity and skepticism within his community and saying this is around, right? There are slaves around us who make no profession of religion. And he says masters not only tolerate this behavior, they actually encouraged it by giving slaves alcohol and urging them to fight and wrestle with one another instead of attending church services. So we see an inability to resolve the problem of evil, right, as one sort of origin of atheism in the slave community, and that sort of manifested as partially as a sort of disrespect for the Sabbath and a disrespect for religious ideas. Another key development that fostered the growth of African-American atheism was pro-slavery religion, right? And this is basically, using religious rhetoric and religious language to justify the institution of slavery. That also had a very long history stretching back into the 15th and 16th centuries with, the curse of Ham, right? But it's something that really picked up in the United States after 1830, in large part because it was sort of a reaction to the burgeoning anti-slavery movement of that time, right? So William Lloyd Garrison began publishing his well-known newspaper, The Liberator, on January 1st, 1831. 2 years later, he and other abolitionists would form the American Anti-Slavery Society. And some of the work they did was, having speakers, whether sometimes former slaves, but other times just people who are against slavery. They supported those efforts, supported petition drives, sent literature down to the South. And so it was very clear to Southerners that the abolitionist movement was growing, was becoming much more popular in the North, right? And so you start to see a reaction to this abolitionist movement with things like the gag rule in Congress in 1836, which automatically tabled any anti-slavery petitions that came to Congress. But you also see other sort of responses to this, and one is kind of theological, right? And using religious rhetoric, using the Bible, and using ministers' words and their sort of cultural authority to bolster and uphold the institution of slavery. And so a number of enslaved people kind of comment on this rise of pro-slavery religion and on this sort of tie between Christianity and slavery as sort of another foundation of Black atheism, right? Henry Bibb notes of white preachers in his autobiography that the slaves, with but few exceptions, have no confidence at all in their preaching because they preach a pro-slavery doctrine. They say, servants, be obedient to your masters, and he that knoweth his master's will and doeth it not shall be beaten with many stripes. So most slaves felt they were destined to die in bondage unless they were sort of delivered by some deity. And when that doesn't happen, Bibb says, they cannot believe or trust in such a religion as above named. So again, this sort of rise of pro-slavery theology in the 1830s and especially the 1840s became another sort of key foundation of rising atheist sentiment among the enslaved community. Now, aside from Frederick Douglass, what we generally see during the era of slavery among many Blacks was not the sort of kind of secular humanism that would come to characterize free thought later on, but rather simply atheism or perhaps agnosticism, even though that specific term wouldn't be coined until the 1860s. And this is largely because of the enslaved people's sort of positionality, right? It's hard to sort of do things, it's hard to participate in movements and social movements or political movements while you are enslaved. But when we see some of these individuals who are free thinkers and who gain their freedom, like Frederick Douglass or William Wells Brown, we do start to see a sort of burgeoning Black humanist sentiment among them, where they're sort of moving from strictly being skeptics to also sort of applying that skepticism into their kind of social and political activism, right? And not being happy with just doubting, but using their doubts and using their critiques of Christianity to try to improve their world. Now, the 19th century is sort of the origins of Black free thought, but it never really became sort of any type of coherent movement among African Americans, right? So there's a good amount of evidence for free thought in the slave community prior to 1865, and then the evidence sort of drops off a little bit. And if you look at the broader scholarship on African American religion, you can see that the fact that slaves gained their freedom, right? 4 million slaves gained their freedom after the Civil War. That was sort of like a great evangelism opportunity for Christian churches and for African American churches, right? So many slaves who might have been skeptical or sort of on the fence before actually now felt, well, maybe there is a God after all. And there's this rhetoric of, you know, Moses leading the Israelites out of bondage and all of that. So you do see a sort of brief drop-off in examples of Black skepticism for about 15 or 20 years after the Civil War. And then you start to see some examples of individual African Americans participating in free thought conventions and writing letters and essays into the Truth Seeker and other free thought journals, people like Bob Sinclair or R.S. King. in the late 19th century. But free thought would really start to kind of take off among African Americans in the early 20th century with the rise of the Harlem Renaissance in the late 19-teens and the early 1920s. Now, the Harlem Renaissance itself has its origins in the Great Migration from the South. So this is sort of a massive relocation of African Americans from the South to northern cities like Chicago, Detroit, Philadelphia, Boston, and New York City. There were sort of push-pull factors, right? So with the start of World War I, the labor force in the North was being depleted by, white Americans were going off to fight in the war. So, and we also, immigration from Europe dropped off. So factory owners started to looking to Black Southerners to fill those needs, right? So there are some of those pull factors, but then there's also the push factor of a revived Ku Klux Klan in the South during this time, economic troubles due to the boll weevil, right? So between 1915 and 1930, approximately 1.5 million Black Southerners migrated to these northern cities. And when they got there, they encountered new economic opportunities. Many hoped to encounter new political opportunities, and that was the case for some. But there was also a lot of sort of racism and backlash in the North as well. And this migration became a sort of origin point for the Harlem Renaissance and for Black free thought for a couple of reasons. One sort of key moment was the end of World War I and what came to be known as the Red Summer of 1919. And this summer witnessed sort of race riots, lynchings all throughout the South and the North. Even soldiers coming back from World War I, Black soldiers who had gone to fight for their country, thinking that displaying their martial valor, displaying their patriotism, and being willing to risk their lives would be an argument for civil rights back home. They came back, and some of them were beaten in their military uniforms when they stepped off trains in both the South and the North. And so what this sort of racist violence did for many African Americans is it pushed them to consider more non-traditional ways of making the argument for racial equality and for fighting Jim Crow and just segregation in general, right? So they started to think like if more overt protests are going to result in these lynchings or racist violence, maybe we take a sort of less overt route, right? And that route became a sort of cultural and intellectual one. And that's sort of the origins of the Harlem Renaissance. Many of the Renaissance's leaders, people like W.E.B. Du Bois and others, believed that showing that African Americans were capable of producing great art, right, or music, or writing great American novels, right, that would itself become an argument for racial equality. So you have this migration, you have this kind of gathering of artists and intellectuals in these various northern cities, and this really provides another foundation for kind of exponential growth in the number of Black freethinkers and in the number of Black freethinkers who were sort of open about their religious skepticism, right? So with the era of slavery, we see a lot of slave narrators writing about other people who were atheists, right? This pro-slavery preacher caused those slaves to be atheists, not necessarily me, because they wanted to portray themselves as good, respectable African Americans for their abolitionist audience, but they're commenting on the presence in their communities. Now, during the Harlem Renaissance and moving on through the 20th century, you get a lot more Black freethinkers willing to sort of express their own religious skepticism. And this moment was also really significant in that, you know, for many Black freethinkers like Zora Neale Hurston or Langston Hughes, people who grew up in sort of smaller southern towns, right? Eatonville, Florida, in the case of Zora Neale Hurston, or Joplin, Missouri, in the case of Langston Hughes. You know, they started to doubt the tenets of Christianity, and they started to have some serious questions pretty early in their lives. But they were like the only skeptic around, right? It wasn't like they were in an open and welcoming community where they could share these ideas and, you know, talk about them without fear of being judged, right? They certainly feared being judged and ostracized by their communities back home. But when they go to New York City, right, and they're gathered at some social event or some cultural event, right, then they can talk about their religious skepticism with people who share that same sort of background and share those same ideas, right? So now all of a sudden, they're able to start building kind of communities of freethinkers. And many of the kind of leading writers of the Harlem Renaissance, Nella Larson, Zora Neale Hurston, Langston Hughes, W.E.B. Du Bois, were all religious skeptics, atheists, agnostics, deists, and they expressed these ideas in a number of different formats, right? Nella Larson was a freethinker whose ideas really came out in some of her personal correspondence, but most notably in her 1928 novel, Quicksand, which focuses on the life of a woman named Helga Crane, who most reviewers saw as being Larson herself, right? A lot of Helga Crane's experiences were similar to those that Larson had had. And the book, right from the start, it opens up with Helga sort of articulating her dissatisfaction with Naxos, an anagram of Saxon, right? The school that she was a teacher at. And a lot of that dissatisfaction was due to religion, right? She complained about being forced to listen to a traveling white preacher who came to the school and commented on how all of the Negroes at Naxos were the best Negroes because they basically knew how to stay in their place, right? They didn't push for too much. They weren't pushing for civil rights. They were just trying to get their sort of industrial education, right? So right away, on like page 2 of this novel, we see Helga really is not feeling Christianity, right? And that sort of just continues throughout the book. She has a number of sort of negative interactions with both Black and white Christians in the book. Towards the end, she ends up, you know, very rashly marrying a revival preacher named the Reverend Mr. Pleasant Green. And she moves from New York City down to Alabama. She has 4 kids in the span of 3 years, one child and a set of twins. And then after the 4th child, she's sort of laid up nearly on her deathbed, right? She ends up surviving it, but is sort of reflecting on her life and realized that she had basically thrown her life away in marrying Green, in marrying the Reverend, in having all these children, and in living a life and subscribing to religious ideas that she didn't really believe in. Towards the end of the novel, she writes, "With the obscuring curtain of religious rent, Helga was able to look about her and see with shocked eyes this thing she had done to herself. She couldn't, she thought ironically, even blame God for it, now that she knew he didn't exist. No more than she could pray to him for the death of her husband, the Reverend Mr. Pleasant Green, the white man's God and his great love for all people regardless of race. What idiotic nonsense she had allowed herself to believe. How could anyone have been so deluded?" So we really see Larson's sharp critique of Christianity here. We see her articulation of atheism in the character of Helga, but you know that really reflects her own ideas And I know that because her personal correspondence also expresses sort of a similar disgust with her in-laws. She was married to a man named Elmer Imes, a physicist from Alabama, and his family was highly religious. And she wrote letters to her literary patron, Carl Van Vechten, sort of calling out her family and kind of making fun of them a little bit. So we know that sort of the ideas expressed in this novel are also kind of how Larson feels herself. And we'd see again and again throughout the 20th century that Black writers used their fictional works to sort of explore religious skepticism. They could do so in a way that gave them a little bit of separation, right? If anybody came and tried to accuse them of being blasphemous or this or that, they could easily say, hey, it was my novel, right? But then you read some personal papers or letters or something like that, and you can see, oh, that's actually what they believed. But it allowed them to sort of be sort of very creative in exploring questions of skepticism and doubt. So along with Larson, another key freethinker of the Harlem Renaissance era was Zora Neale Hurston, who I mentioned had grown up in the all-Black town of Eatonville, Florida, a very prosperous town. She was actually the daughter of the minister in the town. Right. So she grew up in a very religious household, but she began to have doubts about religion very early on, right? She began to have doubts about sort of God's omnipotence, looking around and wondering why sort of God didn't solve certain problems that seemed, that they could be within his purview. She also started to question religion because it seemed like she would witness revival services in her father's church, and people would catch the Holy Spirit and they would be saved and converted and born again. But then a couple of weeks later, maybe a couple of months later, it would be as if that had never happened, right? They still sinned and they still did all of the same things that they had done before, right? So she started to think like, God can't really be that powerful if him coming into your heart doesn't really actually change you as a human being. And so these were sort of incipient doubts about religion, and her development as a freethinker would really start to take place quite a bit more in the mid-1920s when she was studying anthropology and history at Barnard College. And then when she went on to work on a master's degree in anthropology at Columbia with Franz Boas, a freethinker, as her master's advisor. And her ideas would kind of show the influence of thinkers like Ludwig Feuerbach and Friedrich Nietzsche. And basically you could see in her autobiography, Dust Tracks on a Road, that she felt religion was for the weak, right? And she articulated that very clearly. She thought Christianity, just like Nietzsche had argued, was a religion of the weak, that we basically created God, human beings created God to sort of cover up our own weaknesses and our own foibles. And if individuals were strong and self-reliant, then they wouldn't need God, right? So she wrote this all in her 1943 autobiography. The publisher actually got rid of all references to religious belief from the text, and it was only recovered decades later when Alice Walker, who basically sort of rediscovered, if you will, Zora Neale Hurston. She kind of fell into oblivion, for a couple of decades after her death, and her works weren't really being published. But Alice Walker discovered the sort of original text of the autobiography, and now if you go and purchase a newer copy of Dust Tracks on a Road, you see all these references to Christianity as a religion of the weak, and an articulation for herself of basically sort of skirting the line between deism and agnosticism, right? Sometimes she says, I don't really know if God exists, but if he does exist, then it's a God that's so far removed from human life that it would be pointless to like pray to this God. Like we're nothing to this creator, right? So, you know, again and again, my second chapter of the book shows that, you know, so many writers of the Harlem Renaissance, you know, Nella Larson, Zora Neale Hurston, Claude McKay, Alain Locke, who's known as the father of the Harlem Renaissance, W.B. Du Bois, Langston Hughes, a lot of people that we read in African-American literature classes and learn about in African-American history. We know a lot of these people's works, but we don't necessarily know the influence of their religious skepticism on their work, right? Or even that they were religious skeptics in the first place. So the Harlem Renaissance becomes this key moment in sort of the growth of Black free thought in the United States. Another sort of moment in this growth was the rise of radical politics among African Americans, roughly around the same time as the Harlem Renaissance. So I noted that, you know, some African Americans tried to basically shy away from overt politics, right? Overt political organizing due to that white backlash during the Red Summer of 1919. Others embraced sort of traditional forms of political organizing and embraced more sort of radical political parties like the socialists and communists during roughly the same time as the Harlem Renaissance. And they're joining ranks with these two parties. Part of the reason for this is, you know, while there were certainly a lot of racist, socialists, and communists, ideologically, and in a lot of their writings, they spoke more to issues of class than they did to race, right? And they were at least technically open to all people in the working class, right? So we know a lot of, you know, labor union organizers, people like Samuel Gompers, who are highly racist, but nevertheless, on an ideological level, socialism and communism seemed to have the sort of opportunity for collaboration between the races in a way that the Democratic Party certainly did in the early 20th century, and increasingly the Republican Party seemed like it didn't have as well. Right. Also, the communists, for example, were very visible in, you know, particular moments of importance to African Americans and in African American politics. One of these was the Scottsboro Boys incident in the early 1930s, when 9 young Black men were accused of sexual assault and put on trial. And even before, you know, the NAACP or other organizations could get involved, the Communist Party was right there, sort of front and center, helping to fund the legal defense for the Scottsboro Boys, helping to fund sort of travel expenses for the mothers and fathers of those boys, and, you know, help them sort of travel around and raise funds and raise awareness about this situation. So the communists seem to be much more supportive of African Americans than the other two sort of major political parties. And a number of important Black intellectuals and political activists would embrace both the socialist and communist parties. Hubert Harrison was one of these, who was one of the earliest Black socialists. He was an immigrant from the West Indies. He came to Harlem in 1899, I believe. And by 1901, he already had correspondence that indicates he had moved away from the sort of Christianity of his youth, and he had embraced agnosticism. Hubert Harrison would publish essays, would publish articles in the Truth Seeker, the leading free thought journal of the time, would work with white freethinkers in some of their events, like a Thomas Paine birthday dinner. And in some of his writings, he made clear his belief that of all people in the United States, African Americans should be found in the free thought fold, right? Because African Americans, he said, had suffered more than any other group in the country from what he calls the dubious blessings of Christianity. So this was in a piece he wrote in 1912. And he actually uses some of the history I've already talked about in building his argument, right? He uses this history of pro-slavery religion, the ties between race and religion and slavery in the 19th century, but also the way that white ministers and white Christians in the early 20th century used religion to justify segregation and Jim Crow throughout the United States, right? So for Harrison, if you look at the history of the United States, it's very clear that religion had been used to oppress African Americans, and rather than being one of the sort of largest Christian groups in the country, African Americans should actually be the quickest, he noted, to embrace free thought, right? His own sort of path towards free thought came after reading some of the early white freethinkers, right? So reading some of the works of Thomas Paine, reading Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Montesquieu and Diderot and others, right? So what we start to see in the early 20th century is those Enlightenment thinkers that didn't necessarily have an impact during the era of slavery. We actually start to see them having more of an impact on the growth of Black free thought in the early 20th century, right? And people looking back to some of those early 18th and 19th century sources by white freethinkers and using those in sort of developing their own atheism and agnosticism. Another important communist freethinker during this time was Richard Wright. And Richard Wright really he could have been in either chapter. I think I have a brief mention of him in the New Negro Renaissance, but he started publishing more at kind of the tail end of the Renaissance, so I didn't discuss him extensively there. I write more about him in my chapter on socialism and communism. But Wright had grown up in Mississippi in a highly religious household, and in his 1945 autobiography, Black Boy, really the whole first half, the whole of part one is, most of it, the vast majority of that part is sort of a detailing of his growing frustration with Christianity and his move towards atheism. And it's incredibly surprising to me, reading the literary criticism on Richard Wright, and basically I tried to read everything that literary critics had read about him or had written about him, and there's very little mention of that being, an important theme in his autobiography and in his life. There's a lot of discussion of communism. There's a lot of discussion of him being sort of this exemplar of the Great Migration and all that, but very little about his religion. But he talks about these conflicts that he had with his grandmother, with his aunt. And as part of this Great Migration, he would move up to Chicago first in the early 1930s, and then continue on to Harlem in the late 1930s. So he also, while he was in Chicago, embraced the Communist Party, right? And he was a communist for probably close to a decade before he would start to move away from that, which he came to believe was a little too ideologically rigid, and embracing existentialism. But he's another sort of key intellectual, along with W.E.B. Du Bois, Louise Thompson Patterson, W.A. Domingo, Claude McKay, who embraced socialism or communism, and this sort of worked dialectically with their religious ideas, right? Because the communists, their sort of default position was that our members, we think our members should be atheists. atheists, right? If you're a communist, then you should be an atheist. And indeed, I've read accounts of African Americans even attending very liberal churches, like one man, Richard B. Moore, who was an atheist and a communist in New York City in the 1920s and 30s. He writes that, he even went to the Harlem Unitarian Church, which is about as liberal as they get for a Black church or for a Christian church in general. And his communist comrades sort of gave him trouble for that, right? They didn't want them going to any church. So some were attracted first to communism as a political ideology and then would embrace free thought. Others, I argue, were attracted to communism because it was anti-religious and they were already religious skeptics. Now, the last chapter of the book sort of ties together the previous two in looking at both political activity and sort of literary and intellectual activity during the civil rights movement of the 1960s and the 1970s. Now, the civil rights movement is often portrayed as a religious movement, right? And as largely or even primarily a religious movement. But as Barbara Savage points out in her book, Your Spirits Walk Beside Us, very few Black churches actually participated in overt civil rights organizing. She estimates that it's less than 10% of Black churches who openly participated in the civil rights movement. She even says that the fact that we've come to see the civil rights movement as a religious one is a miracle in and of itself, right? And I argue in chapter 4 of the book that secularism and free thought and free thinkers played really key roles in the civil rights movement, in some of its major organizations, in its ideology, and its sort of form of political organizing, and also in the sort of literary and intellectual output of this period. So we can especially see the prominence of freethinkers in the Black Power movement, which began in the mid-1960s. So Black Power emerged out of the civil rights activity of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee in 1966. And Black Power called for a number of different things. It called for sort of focus on Black economic activity, right? Buying Black, right? Promoting Black businesses and whatnot, cooperative economics. A lot of leaders of the Black Power movement were also socialists and communists. It called for developing Black leaders, Black political leaders, right? Especially in what Cornell West calls chocolate cities, right? Cities like Philadelphia, Newark, New Jersey, right? That were majority Black, but had always had white mayors, right? So it called for, in places like that, Black Power advocates said, we should have political officials that actually represent and come from the majority of the community. So like I said, this emerged out of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee in the mid-1960s. SNCC, as it's referred to, had been created in 1960, was initially led by Christian activists such as John Lewis, who was committed to the philosophy of nonviolence. But the philosophy and approach of SNCC soon started to change, especially after James Forman took over as its executive secretary. Now, Forman grew up in rural Mississippi. He had also started moving away from religion as a young man. In a scene repeated in many autobiographies and memoirs of Black freethinkers, Forman writes in his autobiography, The Making of Black Revolutionaries, that he was attending a revival service at the age of 12, and all of his friends yelled out that they had gotten religion. The older people shouted, he said, that they had gotten religion too. And he says, at the age of 12, in a Baptist tradition setting, I did not have the courage to tell my grandmother, who he was living with, that I thought this was all nonsense. I simply observed what had been happening around me, and knew that I too could fabricate some tears in this emotionally charged atmosphere. So I covered my face with my handkerchief and cried, Lord, have mercy. It worked. I was taken off the mourner's bench, and the people talked of how many children got saved that day by the grace of the Lord. So this same scene occurs in Langston Hughes's 1942 autobiography, The Big C. We see something similar in Zora Neale Hurston, right? So again and again, we see Black freethinkers who, at the moment that they supposedly converted to Christianity, that was actually sort of the beginning of their path towards atheism. Now, at 12 years old, he wouldn't have called himself an atheist. He probably didn't quite know what it was. But he writes in his autobiography that he would, embrace atheism for sure after studying philosophy at Wilson Junior College in Chicago. And he would then bring his secular perspective to his civil rights activity. He became the executive secretary of SNCC in 1963, and he grounded his activism in secular humanism. And he stated very explicitly that he believed, like Hubert Harrison and others, that Christianity was a prime reason that Blacks were in a subordinate position in the United States. He said that he thought Christianity promoted a type of kind of otherworldliness where people only focused on salvation and they focused on the afterlife, but they thought that, that was all they needed to do. And it sort of caused them to eschew political activism, Foreman said. So again, he brings this sort of perspective to his civil rights activity. Now he, along with Stokely Carmichael, who would end up beating out John Lewis for the leadership of SNCC in 1966, those two, Foreman and Carmichael, would lead the transition of SNCC away from a sort of religious organization to a secular one. And they inaugurated the Black Power movement, which again had the goals of Black economic advancement, pride in Black culture, independent Black political action, and armed self-reliance, right, or rejection of nonviolence. Now, the main institutional expression of Black power, which is an ideology, a set of ideas, but the main sort of institutional expression of Black power would be the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, which was formed later on in 1966 by Huey Newton. And Newton formed it specifically as a secular organization. Right, he saw the Black Panther Party as sort of an alternative to the Southern Christian Leadership Conference or to the NAACP. They especially embraced the goal of armed self-reliance, right, and armed self-defense. One of the sort of catalysts of the movement was a shooting of an unarmed Black man in early 1966. And then Newton would get some of his friends together in Oakland, California, and start what they would end up calling policing the police, right? Where they sort of followed cop cars around. And in California at the time, it was an open carry state before the Black Panthers. That would change. But they would follow the police around, and whenever the police pulled over a Black person, they would get out the cars, they would stand at a respectful distance with their shotguns or other types of weapons holstered around their bodies. And they would just make sure that nothing untoward happened in that situation. Like I said, in short order, California would enact gun control laws under the leadership, believe it or not, of Ronald Reagan. In the late 1960s, largely because of the Black Panthers. But in addition to armed self-defense, the Black Panthers were based in sort of Huey Newton and others' philosophy of humanism, right? Newton saw the key slogan of the party, "All power to the people," as kind of a humanist alternative to the largely civil rights organizations. And he thought that if any change is going to be affected in Black communities throughout the United States, and any change is going to be affected for African Americans, that they need to take responsibility for making that change happen, right? Belief in God, getting saved, holding revivals, none of that was going to change their material conditions. Organizing themselves, getting individuals to loan out space so that they could have a free breakfast program for children. Those are the types of things that were going to make material changes within Black communities and improve Black life. And like earlier Black freethinkers, they saw the church as conservative, and they advanced a humanist politics that rejected the authority of what they often termed Uncle Tom bootlicking preachers. Now, I'll finish up with a discussion of the Black arts movement. So the Black Panther Party was sort of the political expression of Black power. Its literary and sort of intellectual expression is known as the Black Arts Movement, which lasted from roughly a decade, from the mid-1960s to the mid-1970s. And writers of the Black Arts Movement had multiple goals: promoting and articulating Black pride, Black nationalism, and rejecting a respectability politics that said that if African Americans just display their Christian virtue and don't lie, cheat, steal, live moral and upright lives, then that will convince people to not be racist against them. That's respectability politics. And their rejection of that went hand in hand for many with a rejection of Christianity. So one of the key figures of this movement would be James Baldwin. Baldwin rejected religion because, like Foreman and others, he viewed it as otherworldly and unsuited to addressing the problems of Black people in America. So in his autobiographical work, The Fire Next Time, published in 1963, Baldwin notes that he had been a teenage preacher for 3 years in Harlem in the early 1940s. And even after this experience, he writes that the blood of the Lamb had not cleansed me in any way whatever. I was just as black as I had been the day that I was born, right? And by the end of that 3 years, he says, when he faced a congregation, it began to take all the strength I had not to stammer, not to curse, not to tell them to throw away their Bibles and get off their knees and go home and organize, for example, a rent strike. So very early on, he comes to the same conclusion as many other Black freethinkers do, that religion promotes this otherworldliness that's not really suited for political organizing, right? In this sense, they were obviously kind of caricaturizing religion, or maybe sort of misrepresenting it, right? They didn't really take into account this kind of social gospel strain of Black Christianity. So there obviously were a number of religious individuals who were highly engaged politically, right? But in their sort of own more local experiences, they saw religion as having kind of a deleterious effect on political organizing and political activity. Now, Baldwin was one of the most popular and widely read Black authors of the 1960s, and multiple works, including The Fire Next Time, Blues for Mr. Charlie, and Go Tell It on the Mountain, demonstrate the influence of his rejection of Christianity. And along with Baldwin, Lorraine Hansberry was an important part of the Black arts movement, and another writer whose religious skepticism heavily influenced her literature. So she had been born in Chicago in 1930, moved to Harlem in the mid-1950s, where she actually worked with Black freethinker W.E.B. Du Bois on the anti-imperialist and anti-capitalist magazine Freedom. And she's most well known for her play, A Raisin in the Sun, which is set in the south side of Chicago, sometime between the end of World War II and 1959. It focuses on the Younger family shortly after the death of the patriarch, Walter Younger Sr., and the family is waiting on $10,000 in life insurance money. And a lot of the sort of discussion and the drama revolves around what will be done with the funds. Walter Younger Jr. wants Mama to give him the money to invest in a liquor store, while she wants to use the money to buy a new house and support the medical career of her daughter, Benita. And Benita is sort of a modern woman who embraces feminism, anti-colonialism, and atheism. Many people urge her to marry her middle-class suitor, George Murchison, but she decides to wait until her schooling is complete, putting her career ahead of middle-class domesticity, right? So making the same kind of rejection of traditional family values and routes towards happiness that Nella Larson had made towards the end of Quicksand. Now, when Mama remarks to Benita that she'll be a doctor if God wills it, Benita replies, God hasn't got a thing to do with it. She goes on to express her frustration that God gets all the credit for human achievements, asking whether or not God would be paying her tuition. And Benita's sort of atheism expresses Hansberry's own religious skepticism. She noted in an interview with Mike Wallace shortly after the play came out, Benita is me 8 years ago. So for Hansberry, human beings have the capacity for morality through the use of reason and do not need to believe in God in order to be good people. When human beings achieve something in the world, we should recognize them rather than attribute their accomplishments to an unseen deity. So just to wrap this up, despite views of African Americans as naturally religious, free thought has been a vital and significant component of Black culture and politics since the 19th century. A lot of the people that I've mentioned are some of the kind of leading Black intellectuals, leading political figures in African American history, right? William Wells Brown, first African American to publish a novel, Frederick Douglass, leading Black abolitionist and statesman in the 19th century, on to Zora Neale Hurston, Nella Larson, Langston Hughes, W.E.B. Du Bois, Huey Newton, James Forman, Eldridge Cleaver, James Baldwin, and on, right? This history is not an obscure one. I had to do a lot of research for this book, but a lot of the sources that I was using were readily accessible, right? Autobiographies of these Black intellectuals that have been published, novels, poems, collections of poems. Some of the research did require traveling to archives and things like that. But you can learn a lot about Black free thought just from logging into, documenting the American South, which is a platform that UNC Chapel Hill hosts that has all of the slave narratives that I reference in the book, or just by going to your local library and looking for the publications of Harlem Renaissance thinkers or Black power thinkers from the 1960s. And I think it's really vital to understand and to teach this history and to talk about this history, especially to show Black skeptics today who may be experiencing some of that same sort of ostracism and lack of a supportive community, to show them that they're part of a long tradition of prominent Black freethinkers. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Cameron. And although everybody is muted, I think we should give them a hand wave round of applause, everyone. All right. I do hope that audio came through, did it?
Yep.
Fantastic. All right. Well, this brings us to the Q&A portion. And the way this will work, as I mentioned in the chat, if you have a question for Professor Cameron, please send it to me, Michael Martin, in the Zoom chat, and I will ask them in the order received. I've got several so far, so we want to get going on those. Margaret had the first question in there, so I'm going to spotlight Margaret Downey, my co-host today, and she will lead off with her question, and then we will continue on.
I loved this speech so much. I'm just so excited about all the books you told us about, all these wonderful authors I've never read. And I'm really looking forward to filling my library with some of these books that you mentioned. Do any of the African religions end up surviving in the United States? Or was their African religious roots really paganism? I don't know much about that.
Yeah, so many African religious traditions did survive in kind of fragments in the United States. So you didn't have kind of whole traditions kind of transferring and surviving this sort of torturous Middle Passage experience, but you did have a lot of like individual religious practices, right? So for example, Christianity did not take off among African Americans until the late 19th century. And in large part, it was due to the experience of the Baptists, who focus on baptizing people through full immersion, right? Other groups like the Congregationalists and the Anglicans really hadn't done that. But that sort of immersion in a river or some other body of water was actually similar to some practices in West African nations, right? Also, when Christians started to allow space for the expression of religious sentiment through the body and not just through the mind, right? Because a lot of slaves were, they weren't able to read, not through any fault of their own, but they were just prohibited by law. But when, Methodists started holding revivals, for example, and letting people dance and express religious emotion through their body, that's something that became more appealing because it drew from the particular ways that Africans had practiced religions in West Africa. So what Rabateau and other scholars like Yvonne Choureau show in their works on African American religion is that whole religious systems didn't necessarily survive, but individual practices did, and they kind of melded with Christianity. That's at least in the United States. In other areas of the New World, where you saw a heavier concentration of African Americans, and in some places like Jamaica, it'd be 8 or 9 Black people for every white person. Those are areas where you see a much greater kind of retention of African cultural practices, right? Haiti was another place, and that's why Vodun thrived in Haiti, right? Which drew much more directly from African belief in sort of magic and the power of, amulets and things like that.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. The next question comes from Marilyn, and she has asked me to read it on her behalf, so I will do that. She says, there's a huge disparity in numbers between religious slaves and their descendants versus atheists both during slavery and later. Can you speak to the reasons that an overwhelming number of these people were and are very Christian, believing in this Christian God?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so during the era of slavery, we actually we have a lot of estimates for the number of Christian slaves, and we don't really have any estimates for the number of atheists. But I would say the disparity is that, actually, before I even get into that, one recent work by Daniel Fountain, Slavery, the Civil War, and Salvation, actually cast doubt on this notion that most slaves were Christian, right? He says that we've come to believe that by examining slavery and slave religion in more urban settings. But if we actually look to more rural areas, we can see that African traditional practices thrived quite a bit more. And he argues in that work that on the eve of the Civil War, less than half of the enslaved population were Christians, right? But if we think about the disparity between, sort of freethinkers and religious people, I think on some level it reflects that disparity in American culture more broadly. Yes, there was a greater proportion of white freethinkers than Black freethinkers in the 19th century. But, whites still, like, freethinkers still were not sort of anywhere near a majority of the white population during, the 1820s and 1830s, right? Probably, something along the lines of 10 to 15%, right? If I would estimate. So I think in part it reflects that larger kind of religious, non-religious binary more broadly. When we're looking at the period kind of after slavery and up until now, I think this sort of respectability politics that I mentioned, this idea that in order to gain true equality, in order to make the argument that blacks are equal to whites, African Americans need to show their patriotism, right? They need to show that they're not criminals. They need to show that they're moral, upstanding citizens, right? And a part of that sort of upstandingness, if you will, was being a good Christian, right? This is what Americans do. We go to church on Sunday. If you want to be an American, that's what you need to do too. This idea started to be articulated by Black leaders in the 1790s, would really become much more prominent in Black thought in the late 19th century, right? So the 1880s and the 1890s was really the sort of heyday of respectability politics. And Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham discusses that in some of her important works, historian at Harvard University. And so respectability politics held, really powerful sway over African-American life, probably up to the 1960s. And you still see a lot of remnants of it even today, right? Where there are some people in, my in-laws family that I won't necessarily mention I'm an atheist. I'll just kind of stay quiet during prayers, right? Because I will experience that sort of ostracism and people looking at me weird, right? We're at a moment where I think folks are much more open to free thought and free thinkers than they have been. And over the past 20 years or so, we've seen the number of Black nuns, right? Those who have no religious affiliation. We've seen that number roughly double, right? So it's about 10%. Of African Americans identify as nuns. So the percentage is growing, but I think that this sort of sway of respectability politics is a really important factor in this kind of discrepancy in percentages of white and Black freethinkers and of Black Christians versus Black freethinkers.
Thank you, Professor Cameron. Our next question comes from Marjorie, who would like to ask on her behalf.
Yes, thank you. First of all, wonderful, wonderful talk. I really enjoyed it. Although when you were answering the last question and you talked about the Black nuns, I pictured a lot of women in habits belonging to a Catholic religious order. So you might want to make sure people understand that's not what you're talking about. I mean, I figured it out, but anyway, the question that I have is about Frederick Douglass. I was surprised to see him on the cover of your book and surprised to hear you mention him among important Black free thinkers. And I recently read the David Blight biography of Frederick Douglass, and the point is made over and over again about his religiosity, that he was profoundly devout, according to David Blight. So, you two got to get into a rumble or something, but I just would like you to comment on that.
Yeah, I saw him give a talk here at Chapel Hill shortly after the book came out, and had a lot of questions for him about that, because we've read all of the same sources, and basically Douglass is incredibly hard to sort of pin down to any one religious viewpoint. And, to be a free thinker, I don't necessarily think you have to be an atheist, right? And Douglass at various times expresses atheist sentiments. He expresses kind of deist sentiments. He's not really sure there's a God. If there is, he's not sure that this God has a lot of power. But he does very clearly express a sense of kind of secular humanism, right? That political change is going to come from human beings. At the final meeting of the American Anti-Slavery Society in 1870, he said, he got up and he spoke, and a lot of people were thanking God for freeing the slaves and all that. And he said, look, you can thank God, but I like to thank men, right? I like to thank the individual people who worked to bring about abolition. And he even uses in that speech, he says, no, not in that speech. So he says he doesn't want to thank God, right? And then he's criticized by Black religious leaders. By one bishop of the AME Church pushes back against him for not thanking God, and he also opposed using the Bible in public schools, right? And so he gets a lot of pushback from Black religious leaders, and he writes an article in response that was published in the Boston Investigator, a free thought newspaper, and he says, I simply claim for myself perfect freedom of thought, right? So at various times, he's sort of on this religious spectrum where he's very hard to pin down, but he was a strong advocate of sort of the use of reason, science, independent thought. He was an honorary vice president of the Free Religious Association, which is a sort of liberal / free thought organization in the late 19th century. So yeah, I disagreed with Blight there. I think there were times where he expressed, religiosity, or a great sense of religiosity and belief in God and divine providence. And there were times where he rejected that. And it seems like as he got older, the rejection grew even stronger, right? I think he was much more religious as a young man than he was later in life.
Thank you.
Thank you. I have a question here from Roz. She'd like to ask if she said her theory that Martin Luther King was an atheist. Your thoughts on that?
Actually, I have two questions.
Oh, okay. Oh, that's right, Roz. Would you like to be spotlighted?
Oh, that's fine. That's fine.
Okay. Let me find your name on here. There we go. All right. Please proceed with your questions, Roz.
I thought you were asking on my behalf. I'm sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah,
Okay.
Did you send a couple of questions? I asked the one about MLK, and then I thought maybe you had one other, but.
I do have another one. I asked about
Oh, yes,
the influence of religion on the dynamic in the African-American community, commonly referred to as colorism. I'd like to know your thoughts on that.
I actually don't really know, unfortunately, on both counts. So I haven't read anything about MLK being an atheist. From this talk, you could see that there are a lot of people who fake being Christians, right?
I've heard that.
And right now, according to a lot of the surveys, technically 9 out of 10 African Americans believe in God, but I think a lot of people think that that's what you're supposed to say. So I think that number is probably lower by at least 5 or 10%, if not more. I haven't read much about MLK's atheism. I just haven't really encountered that. In terms of colorism, actually, I think I can speak to that a little bit, and it really goes back to what Winthrop Jordan talks about in his book White Over Black, American Attitudes Toward the Negro. It's an older book. He published it in 1969. But it's a really massive work, and he goes through and explores racial ideas from the 1500s up through the 19th century, I believe. And, part of what he talks about there is the sort of tie between religion and the rise of racial prejudice, right? And this notion that black skin and dark skin is equated with the devil and is equated with sort of evil, and that white skin or lighter skin is seen as closer to sort of goodness, and things like that. So you have, in sort of early modern European culture, strong ties between sort of skin tone and religiosity and morality, right? So I think that same dynamic could be in play in colorism in the early 20th century with the sort of racial ideologies of the majority population kind of seeping into Black thought about themselves and about other African Americans, so that they see sort of lighter African Americans as being more moral and good and virtuous and whatnot. And I think even recent studies have shown that that people are less likely to suspect a lighter skinned African American of, you know, trying to steal something in a department store. They're less likely to get followed around than a darker person, right? So these are sort of, I think, long-standing kind of cultural and racial presuppositions, you know, dating back to Britain, really in the 1500s.
I would be interested in seeing someone doing closer examinations of how African Americans have internalized those ideas and those perceptions.
Yeah.
And it pretty much dictates how we have, as a community, responded not just to racist oppression, economically in the criminal justice system, housing in those different areas, but also how it may impact how we deal with each other.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm guessing some of that work exists. Ibram Kendi probably talks about that, I think, in Stamped from the Beginning a little bit. And then if you want to go to some of the primary sources, Nella Larson actually talks about that herself in her book Passing, which she wrote after Quicksand.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for your questions, Roz, and thank you for your answers, Professor Cameron. We have the next one on tap from Patrick Innes. You're up.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciated the presentation, very enlightening. And I guess my question was, you mentioned Zora Neale Hurston. I know in one of her books, she had a Black preacher as the main protagonist, but he wasn't portrayed in glowing terms like, you know, you often see in literature where the Bing Crosby or, Spencer Tracy portrayal of a preacher. And I think in Black literature and culture, there's this a certain degree of anti-clericism. I guess it may have something to do with the fact that the Black church is one of the few power structures that was permitted to develop in the Black community. And of course, that also makes it kind of a target. But also, if you look at, I remember particularly an Oscar Micheaux movie where the preacher was a parasite and then maybe even kind of a predator. And it seems to me, my perception, that there's that thread in Black literature, in Black culture, where, there's an ambiguous attitude sometimes toward Black preachers and their role they play, and which I guess I would characterize as anti-clericism in a certain degree.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you had any comment on that.
Well, it sort of is a thread, and I think a lot of it comes from the writing of Black freethinkers, right? So the book you're referring to by Hurston is Jonas Gourdvine, and which I think is loosely based on her father. And there's also, Langston Hughes, in his autobiography, talks about this preacher, George Becton, one of the most well-known evangelists in Harlem in the 1920s, basically bilking people out of their money with this thing he called the consecrated dime. You give a dime a day to God. And this is during the Great Depression, right? That African Americans are supposed to give their money to the church when they could barely feed themselves. Let's see, who else? Richard Wright, in his autobiography, talks about this sort of greedy Black preacher, right, eating up all the chicken when he came over to dinner. So this kind of occurs again and again, and I think it's coming from the work of these Black secularists, right? So this, like you said, is kind of another strain a less kind of overtly political strain of Black free thought, and one that really aligns more and ties them more to white freethinkers, right? Where we see this strident anti-clericalism from the earliest years of the free thought movement among whites, especially in like Tom Paine's Age of Reason. So that would sort of, it would be there in some of the slave narratives in the 19th century, but I think it certainly kind of picks up in the 20th century. And James Baldwin too, his work, especially Go Tell It on the Mountain, his first novel, where he's talking about his father. Basically, the preacher in there is sort of modeled on his own father, and he spends a lot of time discussing this preacher's like indiscretions and cheating multiple children out of wedlock, things like that. So it's another way I think that Black atheists and Black freethinkers kind of use their literature to creatively explore elements of secularism.
All right, thank you. Our next question comes to us from Hetty. Hetty, let me spotlight you. Oh, actually, do you want to start your video so I can spotlight you, Hetty, or would you just like to ask your question?
I think I'm just going to ask my question to Dr. Cameron. So firstly, I want to thank you for an excellent book. You have for sure done extremely great research to write about this book, and your talk today as well, very informative. I really enjoyed that. I was wondering if you can give your point of view in terms of what we are dealing with today in terms of the disparity with COVID, Black Lives Matter, and how you think that can or cannot have an impact on Black freethinkers today.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think historically we've seen that sort of tragedies, right? Whether they're wars or economic tragedies or things like that, are things that call into question, right? Notions that God is loving and all powerful and looking out for people's interests. And something on the scale of COVID certainly, I think, has the power to do that. The Black Lives Matter movement is a very religiously diverse movement. I'm actually co-editing a collection of essays right now called Race, Religion, and Black Lives Matter, where we look at sort of the influence of, Black Muslim women in the movement. I'm writing an essay on Black Unitarian Universalists and their participation in the movement. So it's very religiously diverse, but I think it's a movement that's much more opening and welcoming of Black secularists than any other civil rights movement in our history. So that, as well as we see the sort of growth of BLM as a political movement, I think it has the opportunity to also start to transform Black religious life and make Black religious liberalism and secularism more prominent.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for your question. We have a question from Diane, who is asking, can we find out if the people who went to Liberia were mostly free thinkers?
Yeah, I haven't done any research on them. What little I have read actually shows that they saw their move to Liberia as sort of a fulfillment of biblical prophecy, right? Especially Psalm 68:31, princes shall come out of Egypt and Ethiopia shall stretch forth their hands unto God. So this sort of returning from the New World, or from Canada, right, where they initially were, over to first Sierra Leone and also Liberia. That returning they saw as kind of the fulfillment of biblical prophecy. So I think, there probably were some skeptics in that group. I haven't come across any writings of skeptics going there, but I'm sure there were. This speaks to, what Patrick was talking about in his introduction, that while the term atheism or the term agnosticism might be relatively new in our culture, as long as people have believed in God, there have been people around that said, no, this is BS, right? So I'm guessing that there were some skeptics in, the group of immigrants, but I haven't come across references to them or writings by them.
All right, our next question, someone in the chat would like to know why so many African Americans find Islam attractive.
I think I saw in the comments here, somebody mentioned that, a lot of slaves were Muslim, right? So many slaves came from nations in West Africa or North Africa that had been conquered by Muslims and that their leaders had converted to Islam. So there were already a number of Muslims in the United States as early as the 18th century, right? If we're looking more recently, right, into sort of variations of Islam, like the Nation of Islam or the Five Percenters, right? Some of these had a lot of appeal to African Americans, partially because they were sort of Black, partially because of the Black nationalist elements, right? And that Muslims promoted the development of Black businesses, right? And argued that we need our own land to develop Black nations, right? Also, it was a movement heavily built on respectability politics, but a sort of different type of respectability politics than you saw in like the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. So in the 1960s, for example, in the Nation of Islam, you couldn't smoke or drink alcohol, right? That was seen as something that was preserving Black life, right? And showing the importance of Black life by not putting those poisons into your body. But, it's also kind of respectable, right? They had to be clean shaven, wear suits, things like that. But they also advocated armed self-defense, right? That's the sort of contrast to SCLC. So it spoke to sort of a particular vision of masculinity, I think, in the 1960s and 70s, and some of those ideas are still kind of prevalent today. We also have a lot of immigration starting in the 1960s from African nations, from the Caribbean, right? And that has led to the rise of Islam in Black communities, not only sort of the Nation of Islam variants, but sort of kind of traditional Islam as well.
All right, thank you. We have two more questions currently. I'm going to ask this one for someone in the chat. They said, no president has ever been more inclusive to those who consider themselves non-believers than Barack Obama. Is there any evidence that he privately counts himself in our camp? Is he on our team? Do you know anything about that?
I mean, I suspect he is. So, no Black person right now is going to be elected president if they're an atheist, right? Obama is obviously, to be president, has to be one of the canniest and smartest political thinkers. Well, I guess you can get elected without being canny or smart. But prior to 2016, you had to be really intelligent to be president, right? You had to have some sort of smarts about you, and some, political instincts. And so I think that, a lot of his writings kind of hint at a sort of secular perspective, and you look at him or read him talking about some of the people that he was studying in college at Columbia, right? Some of the philosophers, and that he liked these philosophers. And I'm like, okay, he's probably like at least agnostic or something like that. But you're not going to win over the majority of Black voters today, I don't think, if you are an open atheist. So, whether he is or not, I mean, only he knows, because I think if he is an atheist, he's been smart enough not to write about it, because he had those political ambitions from a very young age, right? He didn't go right to law school. I think he worked as a community organizer for like 5 years. So went to law school around 27 and started to develop his political ambitions pretty quickly, right? Probably by the time he got elected editor of the Harvard Law Review. So, you know, he started to sort of carve out a particular image of himself from a very young age, right? From the early 1990s, when he wrote Dreams from My Father and articulating a particular identity. And so I think, you know, if he is a secularist, he just hasn't really written about that in public. But like the comment says, you know, was very open to non-believers. I think even mentioned non-believers in his first inaugural address.
All right, thank you, Professor Cameron. Our final question of the Q&A comes from Marjorie, but everybody can feel free to hang out and chat at the post-event social if you have any more questions. So Marjorie, would you like to take us home?
Sure. Hi again. I would just say that no white person can be elected president either if that person is frank about his or her atheism. If he's able to lie about it and do photo ops regularly to pretend that he's a believer, then sometimes he can manage to get in. You already addressed this a little bit in your talk, but I was very gratified to hear about religious leaders and religious organizations in the civil rights movement, and what you told us about, was it Barb Savage? That only 10%,
Barbara Savage's book.
Savage's book, only 10% of churches really participated. But the leadership, the very public leadership, you know, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King and Rabbi Abraham Heschel and the Nation of Islam was, of course, very present at the March on Washington and so forth. You know, what I would welcome a few more comments about that. Is it the same idea that, well, you're not going to get elected president unless you at least can persuade people that you're a believer, and maybe no one's going to get behind your movement unless you have religious leaders up there? I don't really know what I'm asking, but
I think
there's something smart to say.
I think there's partially that same dynamic at play. So this immediately brings to mind Stokely Carmichael, who wrote about his sort of path towards agnosticism. In his autobiography, says that by the time he had graduated Bronx High School of Science, he was already an agnostic. He then went to Howard University, started becoming involved in SNCC very quickly, but would never really sort of publicize his irreligiosity, right? Now others did, right? James Foreman, for example, did. He got up at the Riverside Church in New York City in 1969 and called out Christian churches and argued that they owed reparations to Black people, and others were very open, but there were some that, you know, were skeptics and were atheist agnostics, but knew that that wouldn't really allow them to be as effective politically as they wanted to, right? And Carmichael is very kind of explicit in speaking to that. He's like, I'm not going to be able to go organize in the South if I'm talking about there is no God, right? Now, it is true that a lot of the kind of leading figures you mentioned were highly religious, but also, like, you know, Eldridge Cleaver and Huey Newton, leaders of the Black Panther Party, were very openly non-religious, right? And were very openly sort of opposed to most of the ideological presuppositions, especially the philosophy of nonviolence, as the major civil rights leaders. So, yeah, I think that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. And, you know, we did have one last question sneak in under the wire, and it's a good question. Are you in touch with any of the relatives of the great writers whom you've mentioned?
I am not. No, that's something I should have done. I'm going to be writing a second volume on Black free thought. So this book goes up until 1975. I'm going to write another volume on Black free thought from 1975. Sort of up to like 2015 probably. And I think for that one, I'll rely a lot more on like oral interviews and stuff like that. For this one, I found that there were plenty of available sources. If I had a question about, whether somebody who wrote a novel was really a free thinker, I just went to like their personal papers and letters and stuff like that. And it kind of confirmed it for me. But I think for this newer phase of the project, I'll certainly do a lot more oral interviews. And that's where I may get in touch with, some of the descendants of these writers. So.
Fantastic. All right. Well, everyone, once again, why don't we give a big thank you to Professor Cameron for his fantastic presentation. At this time, I would like to turn over back to Margaret, my co-host and the president of the Freethought Society, and she's got some final remarks.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Cameron. I really appreciated you mentioning Thomas Paine in your talk. That was a very special thing to me, and I appreciated that. It was a wonderful presentation. And thank you, Michael, for conducting the question and answer session so well.
You're very welcome.
I also thank Patrick Ennis for that wonderful introduction of today's speaker. You always do such a terrific job, Patrick. Thank you. Before we begin the 5 to 10 minute break and post-event social, I have just a few announcements. We've posted many upcoming events on the Freethought Society and the Backyard Skeptics and the SoCal Secular Coalition meetup pages. We've created some fantastic new events, and we've scheduled things all the way through December of 2020, including speakers, a Secular Day of the Dead, and a Tree of Knowledge winter holiday celebration. And speaking of the Tree of Knowledge, I want everyone to see that this is the ornament I created for the 2020 Tree of Knowledge display. Do you see it, Professor Cameron, your book cover?
Yeah, great, thank you.
So we now have an ornament of your fabulous book to put on our tree, and it will be added to our recommended list of reading.
So great, thank you.
All right, and let's see. So the next event we have scheduled is a virtual 70th birthday party for Margaret Downey, which is scheduled for Saturday, August 16th at noon Pacific time. If you're out on the West Coast where I am, it's at noon. If you are on the East Coast where she is, Philadelphia area, 3 p.m. Eastern time. There will be musical performances and filmed birthday greetings from many of her friends. I've got some videos rolling in already. We've got clips from Penn Jillette, John Davidson, and others. We invite you to log on to the Zoom party with your own dessert and beverage, share stories about your special memories with Margaret, and we'll use the share screen option that day. So if you have any photos or audio available, I can spotlight you as a speaker that day and you can share them with her as a special birthday gift. So for now, so please again, that is August 16th, Saturday. We'd love to have all of you there. You can sign up through the Freethought Society website to RSVP there. So for now, please grab a drink and a snack, refresh yourself if you need to step out for a couple minutes, and then we're all going to join back in a few for the post-event social. Margaret, do you have anything to add at this point?
Thank you for mentioning my 70th birthday. I don't feel 70, but
you don't
I'm
look
so
it
excited.
And you don't act it. You don't look it and you do not act it.
Well, I got so excited recently because I heard that Teller sent a video that you haven't received yet. And Anne Duran is coming to my birthday party, and so is John Delancey.
Excellent, excellent. Also, we'll have greetings from both Penn and Teller. I watched Penn's 3 times because it was hilarious.
I haven't watched anything because I want to be surprised.
I'm glad you haven't seen it yet. I feel special right now. I'm the only one.
Professor Cameron, are you needing to leave or do you want to hang out for a while?
I do have to leave. I've got 2-year-old twins and a 4-year-old upstairs that are getting kind of restless.
Okay. Well, thank you for taking the time to be with us.
She's trying to give them baths, and it doesn't sound like it's going well. So
please send me pictures of the children. I'd love to see them.
Will do, will do. Thank you again, everyone. I really
Thank you.
appreciate you all showing up, and this has been a great time.
Thank you, Professor Cameron. We'll see you again. Thank you.
All right, take care.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.